Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, Richard Nixon, Anwar Sadat, Lee Kuan Yew and Margaret Thatcher. Each transformed his or her society, and all contributed to the emergence of a new world order. FROMRISTOCRCY. The six leaders were profoundly affected by the dramatic half-century when Europe, which for 400 years had shaped the unfolding of history while dominating an increasing portion of the globe, proceeded to consume much of its own substance in two world wars that were in effect a European civil war. They then helped shape its aftermath, in which economies had to be reorganized, domestic structures redefined, and international relations reordered. The six also faced the challenges of the Cold War, and the disruptions brought by decolonization and globalization, all of which continue to reverberate today. The period in which these leaders had grown up was transformative in a cultural sense. Both the political and social structures of the West were irrevocably changing from a hereditary and aristocratic model of leadership to a middle-class and meritocratic one. As they came of age, the lingering residue of aristocracy was combining with the emerging paradigm of merit, at once broadening the base of societal creativity and expanding its scope. Today, meritocratic principles and institutions are so familiar that they dominate our language and thinking. Take the word nepotism, which implies favoring one's relatives and friends, especially in appointment to posts of responsibility. In the pre-meritocratic world, nepotism was omnipresent, indeed, the customary way of life, yet the practice carried no implications of unfair advantage. To the contrary, blood relations were a source of legitimacy. As originally conceived by the philosophers of ancient Greece, aristocracy meant rule by the best. Such rule, emphatically not hereditary, was morally justified by taking an aspect of human life assumed to be given, the natural inequality of endowments, and harnessing it for the public good. Plato's myth of the metals portrayed an aristocratic political order based on what is now called social mobility. In his telling, youths, including girls with souls of gold, even if born to parents of brass or silver, could rise according to their natural talents. As a social system that shaped the history of Europe over the centuries, however, aristocracy took on an entirely different meaning. A hereditary nobility which endowed its leaders with power and status. The defects of aristocracy in the hereditary sense, such as the risk of slipping into corruption or inefficiency, are easily recalled today. Less well remembered are its virtues. For one, aristocrats did not understand themselves to have acquired their status through individual efforts. Position was inherent, not earned. As such, although there existed wastrels and incompetence, the creative aspect of aristocracy was bound up with the ethic of noblesse oblige, as in the phrase, "To whom much is given much is expected." Since aristocrats did not achieve their station, the best of them felt an obligation to engage in public service or social improvement. In the realm of international relations, leaders from different nations belonged to this social class and shared a sensibility transcending national boundaries. Hence they generally agreed on what constituted a legitimate international order. This did not prevent conflicts, but it did help limit the severity of them and facilitate their resolution. The concepts of sovereignty, equilibrium, the legal equality of states, and the balance of power, which were the hallmarks of the Westphalian system, developed in a world of aristocratic practices. The banes of aristocratic foreign policy were overconfidence in intuition and a self-regard that invited stagnation. Still, in negotiations where position was felt to be a birthright, mutual respect among competitors and even adversaries was expected, though not always guaranteed, and flexibility was uninhibited by a prior commitment to perpetual success, however short-term the issue. Policies could be judged in terms of a shared conception of the future, rather than of a compulsion to avoid even temporary setbacks. As a result, an aristocracy at its best could maintain a sense of excellence that was antithetical to the demagogic temptations sometimes afflicting popular democracy. To the extent that an aristocracy lived up to its values of restraint and disinterested public service, its leaders would tend to reject the arbitrariness of personal rule, governing through status and moral suasion instead. Over the 19th and early 20th centuries, the assumptions underpinning hereditary aristocracy were steadily stripped away by the waning of religious belief, the unleashing by the French Revolution of movements toward greater political equality, and shifts in wealth and status from the burgeoning market economy. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, the First World War revealed the incongruity between waning aristocratic political values on the one hand and emerging technological realities on the other. Even as the former had stressed the imperative of restraint and peaceful evolution, the latter magnified the destructiveness of war. The system broke down in 1914, when rising national passion swept aside the previous safeguards, allowing technology to supply the means for a constantly escalating level of conflict, which over more than 4 years of attritional war undermined existing institutions. Winston Churchill observed in The Gathering Storm that the First World War had been a conflict, not of governments, but of peoples, in which the lifeblood of Europe was poured out in wrath and slaughter. By war's end, Churchill could write, because Europe's leaders had failed to forestall the oncoming catastrophe, or to contain it once it erupted, the First World War eroded trust in the political elite, leaving behind a weakened leadership that in key countries would be overturned by totalitarian rulers. At the same time, the 1918 peace settlement proved at once insufficiently congruent with widely held values to induce a commitment to the new order, and strategically unsound in failing sufficiently to weaken the defeated parties to eliminate their capacity for revenge. This had many consequences. The most momentous was the Second World War. In both world wars, the all-out mobilization of peoples, commanding their energies and exploiting their mutual antipathies, represented the earliest and bleakest consequence of middle-class ascendancy. Yet, after the turmoil of the Second 30 Years' War had passed, this social transformation would reveal itself to be compatible with international stability and statesmanship. A world of self-confident nation-states, with the middle class wielding the major share of political and cultural power, proved capable of producing leaders who conducted responsible and creative politics. Two related social forces, meritocracy and democratization, enabled and institutionalized the rise of middle-class leaders. One of the French Revolution's rallying cries had been careers open to talents. From the middle of the 19th century, the adoption of meritocratic principles and institutions in the West, such as entrance examinations, selective secondary schools and universities, and recruitment and promotion policies based on professional standards, created new opportunities for talented individuals from middle-class backgrounds to enter politics. Simultaneously, the expansion of the franchise shifted both the social and the political center of gravity toward the middle class as well. None of the 6 leaders studied in this volume came from an upper-class background. Konrad Adenauer's father had been a non-commissioned officer in the Prussian army, and then a clerk. His son climbed through the standard levels of education in the German Empire. Charles de Gaulle's grandparents had been both well-educated and prosperous, but his father was a schoolteacher. The son became the first in his family to serve at high levels of government. Richard Nixon was the product of a lower middle-class upbringing in Southern California. Anwar Sadat, the son of a clerk, struggled to obtain a reference in support of his application to the Egyptian Military Academy. Lee Kuan Yew, born to downwardly mobile Chinese, Singaporean parents, relied on scholarships in Singapore and Britain to pursue his education. Margaret Thatcher was a grammar school graduate and the daughter of a grocer, the second of a middle-class background after Edward Heath, and the first woman to become leader of Britain's Conservative Party. None of them had a starting point that suggested later eminence. Their humble backgrounds allowed them to defy the conventional political categories of insider and outsider. Both Sadat and de Gaulle were military officers who came to power through a crisis in their countries. Nixon and Adenauer were experienced and well-known politicians who nonetheless spent years in the political wilderness. Of the 6, Thatcher and Lee entered office in the most orthodox manner, through party politics in a parliamentary system, but constantly questioned prevailing orthodoxy. Much like their aristocratic predecessors in the 19th century, but unlike many of their 20th century contemporaries, they were not primarily concerned with short-term, tactical advantage. Instead, their origins and experiences far from power lent them perspective, allowing them to articulate the national interest and transcend the conventional wisdom of their day. The increasingly meritocratic institutions that had allowed them to shadow, and often as a consequence of war. Germany's general staff and efficient, non-nepotistic bureaucracy had their antecedents in Prussian reforms adopted after the shock of battlefield defeats in the Napoleonic Wars. De Gaulle attended Saint-Cyr, the military academy founded by Napoleon in 1802, to develop a professional officer corps. Another such grande école, the Selective and Elite Institut d'études politiques, Sciences Po, was founded after the Franco-Prussian War had revealed inadequacies of French political and administrative leadership, deficiencies which were to be remedied by cultivating the talents of the next generation. The Industrial Revolution also played its part in the growing emphasis on education, as the economic historian David Lanz argues. All the old advantages, resources, wealth, power, were devalued, and the mind established over matter. Henceforth the future lay open to all those with the character, the hands and the brains. With success increasingly ascribed to intelligence and effort rather than birthright, education became the quintessential road to advancement. Thanks to these changes, the 6 leaders were able to attend rigorous secondary schools, most of them selective, and all of them public-spirited if not government-administered. Competition for high marks in examinations and scholarships was an important aspect of life. Beginning in high school, and continuing in some cases into college, they were taught a wide range of subjects, including especially the humanities, as if in preparation for the challenges of leadership, for which a sense of history and the ability to deal with tragedy are indispensable. Above all, they received an education which would help them to understand the world, the psychology of others and themselves. The meritocratic revolution affected nearly every aspect of life, valorizing achievement and the aspiration to careers transcending one's family origins. The ideal of excellence was preserved from the earlier aristocratic age, and if anything given a new and stronger, more individualistic emphasis. As Thatcher observed in 1975, opportunity be different. Universities and careers were progressively, though still imperfectly, opened up to women, ethnic and racial minorities, and those from non-elite backgrounds. Societies benefited from the resulting intellectual diversity and openness to different leadership styles. These factors enabled the leaders described in this volume to combine aristocratic qualities with meritocratic ambitions. The synthesis enshrined public service as a worthy endeavor, which encouraged aspirations to leadership. Both the school system and the broader society in which they were raised put a premium on academic performance, but both, above all, placed a strong emphasis on character. Correspondingly, the 6 leaders were brought up with priorities beyond their grades and test scores. These, while important, were not treated as an end in themselves. Hence Li's recurring references to the Junzi or Confucian gentleman, and de Gaulle's striving to become a man of character. Education was not merely a credential to be obtained in one's youth and set aside. It was an unending effort with both intellectual and moral dimensions. The particular middle-class values in which the 6 leaders were steeped from childhood included personal discipline, self-improvement, charity, patriotism, and self-belief. Faith in their societies, encompassing gratitude for the past and confidence in the future, was taken for granted. Equality before the law was becoming an entrenched expectation. Unlike their aristocratic forebears, these leaders had a deeply rooted sense of national identity, which inspired their conviction that the loftiest ambition was to serve their fellow citizens through leadership of the state. They did not style themselves citizens of the world. Li may have received his university education in Britain, and Nixon may have prided himself on the extent of his travels before becoming president, but neither adopted a cosmopolitan identity. To them, the privilege of citizenship implied a responsibility to exemplify the particular virtues of their own nations. Serving their people and embodying the greatest traditions of their society was a high honor. The positive effects of this value system, as manifested in the American context, were well described by the historian. Another factor common to each of the leaders except Li was a devout religious upbringing, Catholic for Adenauer and de Gaulle, Quaker for Nixon, Sunni Muslim for Sadat, and Methodist for Thatcher. For all the differences among these faiths, they uniformly served certain secular purposes. Training in self-control, reflecting on faults and orienting toward the future. These religious habits helped to instill self-mastery and a preference for taking the long view, 2 essential attributes of statesmanship, which these leaders exemplified. HRDTRUTHS. What were the commonalities in the meritocratic leadership of these 6 figures? What lessons can be drawn from their experiences? All were known for their directness, and were often tellers of hard truths. They did not entrust the fate of their countries to poll-tested, focus group rhetoric. Who do you think lost the war? Adenauer uncompromisingly asked his fellow members of parliament, who were complaining about the terms imposed by the Allies in their post-war occupation of Germany. Nixon, who pioneered the use of modern marketing techniques in politics, still prided himself on speaking without notes based on his mastery of world affairs in a direct and plain-spoken way. Skillful in maintaining political ambiguity, Sadat and de Gaulle nonetheless spoke with exceptional clarity and vividness when seeking to move their people toward ultimate purposes, as did Thatcher. These leaders all had a penetrating sense of reality and a powerful vision. Mediocre leaders are unable to distinguish the significant from the ordinary. They tend to be overwhelmed by the inexorable aspect of history. Great leaders intuit the timeless requirements of statecraft and distinguish, among the many elements of reality, those which contribute to an elevated future and need to be promoted from others which must be managed and, in the extreme case, perhaps only endured. Thus both Sadat and Nixon, inheriting painful wars from their predecessors, sought to overcome entrenched international rivalries and initiate creative diplomacy. Thatcher and Adenauer found that a strong alliance with America would be most advantageous for their countries. Li and de Gaulle chose a lesser degree of alignment, which was appropriate for adjustment to changing circumstances. All 6 could be bold. They acted decisively on matters of overriding national importance, even when conditions, domestic or international, appeared decidedly unfavorable. Thatcher dispatched a Royal Navy task force to recover the Falkland Islands from Argentina, even as many experts doubted the expedition's feasibility, and Britain itself remained mired in a devastating economic crisis. Nixon undertook a diplomatic opening to China, and arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, before withdrawal from Vietnam, had been completed and against much conventional wisdom. De Gaulle's refrain, as his biographer Julian Jackson has observed, was "I have always acted as if, that is, as if France were larger, more unified and more confident than it really was." Each understood the importance of solitude. Sadat enhanced his reflective habits in prison, as did Adenauer at a monastery during his internal exile. Thatcher made some of her most consequential decisions while reviewing her papers alone in the early hours of the morning. De Gaulle's home in the remote village of Colomiers-les-Deux-Églises became an intrinsic part of his life. Nixon often separated himself physically from the White House, withdrawing to the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, Camp David, or San Clemente. Away from the lights and cameras and daily impositions of command, these leaders benefited from stillness and reflection, especially before major decisions. A striking commonality among the 6 leaders, and a paradox, was their divisiveness. They wanted their peoples to follow along the path, the inevitable byproduct of the transformations they sought. An example from de Gaulle's presidency is illustrative. During the January 1960 riots in Algeria, known as the Week of the Barricades, I was in Paris meeting with members of the French defense establishment. Referring to de Gaulle's handling of the situation, one officer said to me, "Whenever he appears, he divides the country." Yet in the end, it was de Gaulle who would overcome the Algerian crisis and return his country to a shared view of national purpose, just as he had brought the French nation back from the humiliation of capitulation in the Second World War. Similarly, a leader does not undertake fundamental economic reforms as Thatcher did, or seek peace with historic adversaries as Sadat, or build a successful multi-ethnic society from the ground up as Lee, without offending entrenched interests and alienating important constituencies. Adenauer's acceptance of the restrictions accompanying Germany's post-war occupation invited vituperation from his political critics. De Gaulle survived and provoked countless confrontations, but his last great public act was to de-escalate the protests by students and labor unions that had brought France to the brink of revolution in May 1968. Sadat was martyred not only for bringing peace between his people and Israel's but, above all, because of his justifying it by principles some considered heretical. Both during their years in government and afterwards, not everyone admired these six leaders or subscribed to their policies. In each case they faced resistance, often carried out for honorable motives, and sometimes by distinguished opposing figures. Such is the price of making history. THEFALTERINGMERITOCRSCY. At least in the West, there are signs that the conditions which helped to produce the six leaders profiled in this book face their own evolutionary decay. The civic patriotism that once lent prestige to public service appears to have been outflanked by an identity-based factionalism and a competing cosmopolitanism. In America, a growing number of college graduates aspire to become globe-trotting corporate executives or professional activists. Significantly fewer envision a role as regional or national level leaders in politics or the civil service. Something is amiss when the relationship between the leadership class and much of the public is defined by mutual hostility and suspicion. The West's secondary schools and universities remain very good at educating activists and technicians. They have wandered from their mission of forming citizens, among them, potential statesmen. Both activists and technicians play important roles in society, drawing attention to its faults and the various means by which they might be corrected. But the broad and rigorous humanistic education that shaped prior generations of leaders has fallen out of fashion. The technician's education tends to be pre-professional and quantitative. The activist's hyper-specialized and politicized. Neither offers much history or philosophy, the traditional wellsprings of the statesman's imagination. Excellent test scores and sterling resumes lead today's elite to believe it has earned its power, and possesses it by right rather than by privilege, according to the political theorist Yuval Levin, a perceptive observer of today's faltering meritocracy. We are substituting a cold and sterile notion of intellect for a warm and spirited understanding of character as a measure of worth. The most profound problem, in his view, is located in the realm of elite conduct. Whereas 19th century aristocrats understood much would be expected of them, and the meritocrats of the 20th century pursued values of service, today's elites speak less of obligation than of self-expression or their own advancement. What is more, they are being formed within a technological environment that challenges the very qualities of character and intellect that historically have served to bind leaders to their people.